There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when something sacred is broken. Not the silence of peace, not the quiet of a still evening, or the hush of a sleeping house. This silence is different. It is the silence of 200 people holding their breath at the exact same moment. The silence of witnesses who know they are watching something that cannot be undone. Sabrina Mills knew that silence well. She had grown up inside it. She had learned from the age of 11 that silence was what filled a room after the people you loved most were suddenly, permanently gone. She had learned to live inside that silence, to work inside it, to carry it the way other people carried hope, quietly and without complaint. But the silence that fell over the Iron Veil Pack's great hall on the night of the Harvest Moon ceremony was a different creature entirely. This silence had teeth. She stood perfectly still near the iron-hinged doors at the far end of the hall, her worn leather notebook pressed against the front of a simple sage-green dress she had ironed 3 times that afternoon, just to feel like she belonged in the same room as everyone else. The harvest moon hung enormous and golden outside the tall stone windows, casting its ancient light across the polished oak floors and the 200 faces now turned in her direction. She did not look at any of them. She was looking at the thin trace of warmth on the back of her hand, the warmth she had just wiped from her upper lip, with a gesture so practiced and quiet that most people in the room probably hadn't even noticed it. Most people. The hollow feeling behind her sternum was extraordinary. It was not pain exactly, or rather, it was more than pain. It was the feeling of something being removed, something ancient and precious and entirely hers, carved out of the center of her chest with a precision that left the edges clean and the wound enormous. A severed soul tie felt, it turned out, exactly like that. She had always wondered. Now she knew. Behind her, she could hear the careful sound of Lorelei Haskins settling back into the space at Bess Doolin's side, the soft rustle of an expensive dress, and the quiet click of expensive shoes on expensive flooring. She could hear Bess's breathing normalize. She could hear his father, Ralph Doolin, exhale slowly near the stone fireplace, the long, measured exhale of a man who had just gotten exactly what he wanted. Sabrina straightened her spine, vertebra by vertebra, quietly, without performance. She lifted her chin, and then, in a voice that carried across the silent hall without a single tremor, she said the words that sealed the night into history. "I accept your rejection, Bess Doolin. I hope the life you have chosen is worth the price you just paid for it." She turned. She walked. 10 steps, that was all she needed. 10 steps to the iron-hinged doors, and then she would be outside, in the cold, honest mountain air, where she could finally allow herself to feel the full, the staggering weight of what had just happened. 8 steps. 6. Then the candle flames bent. Every single one of them. The 50 ivory candles lining the stone windowsills, the pillar candles on the long cedar tables, the votives clustered around the ceremonial moon altar at the far end of the hall. They all bent simultaneously in the same direction, as though something enormous outside had displaced the air. The oak floor vibrated beneath her feet. Her inner wolf, the quiet, subdued creature who had lived inside her chest for 23 years without ever making much noise, went completely, absolutely still, and the iron doors began to open. 3 hours before the ceremony, the Iron Veil Pack's archive room was the quietest place in the entire estate. That was precisely why Sabrina loved it. The archive occupied the ground floor of the East Wing, a long, warm room with stone walls and low timber ceilings, lined from floor to ceiling, with shelves of leather-bound ledgers, territorial scrolls, boundary maps, and pack records dating back over 100 years. The lamps were the old amber glass kind that cast a golden, unhurried light over everything. The smell was ink and old paper, and the particular dry warmth of preserved history. A smell that Sabrina had understood from the very first time she walked into this room at the age of 12 as the smell of things that lasted. She was sitting at the wide cedar work table in the center of the room, her attendance record spread open in front of her, cross-referencing the evening's guest list against the estate's catering order with a fine tipped pen. Her handwriting was small and precise. Every column was perfectly aligned. She had been here since 7 that morning. She would be here until the ceremony began at 9 that evening. This was not unusual. Sabrina Mills had been the Iron Vale Pack's head records keeper and archive curator since she was 19 years old. The youngest person to hold the position in the Pack's recorded history, a fact that appeared nowhere in the official records because no one had thought to write it down. She had taken the job not because anyone asked her to, not because someone recognized her aptitude and offered her an opportunity, but because the archive had been descending into quiet chaos for 3 years after the previous curator retired, and Sabrina had simply begun organizing it, one shelf at a time, after her regular duties, that in the evenings and on weekends, with a lamp and a pot of tea and no audience at all, by the time anyone in the Pack leadership noticed the archive was suddenly functional again, Sabrina had already reorganized the entire territorial documentation system, cross-indexed the bloodline records, and quietly resolved 2 boundary disputes that had been festering for years, simply by locating the original signed agreements that proved Iron Vale's position was correct. Alpha Ralph Doolin had nodded when informed of this. He had said, without looking up from his own paperwork, "Good. Keep doing that." That was the whole of it. No title change, no acknowledgement at the Pack assembly, just the quiet, implicit understanding that the girl in the archive would continue to handle whatever needed handling, and the Pack would continue to not think very much about her at all. Sabrina had accepted this the way she accepted most things, without complaint, and with the private, steady knowledge that the work itself was worth doing, regardless of who noticed. Her parents had taught her that. Ephraim and Glenda Mills had been Pack healers, patient, skilled, deeply respected within the lower ranks, and almost entirely invisible to the upper ones. They had died on the eastern border when Sabrina was 11, during a rogue skirmish that lasted less than 4 hours and was never fully explained in any official report. Sabrina had looked for those reports, years later. She had found them in the archive, misfiled under a different date, and she had read them with the careful or detached attention of someone who had already finished grieving and was now simply looking for the truth. The truth was that her parents had gone to the border because they were asked to. The truth was that the healers were sent in before the enforcers had secured the perimeter. The truth was that no one in the Pack leadership had been held accountable because the Millses were lower ranked, and lower ranked Pack members dying in service of the Pack was considered, in the cold accounting of Iron Vale politics, an acceptable cost. Sabrina had filed the reports back in their correct location. She had not spoken about what she found to anyone. She had simply continued working. After her parents' deaths, she had been taken in by Winnie Hobbs, the Pack's den mother, a warm, a perpetually overwhelmed woman who smelled of rosemary and wood smoke, and who was managing 11 other children in a house designed for 6. Winnie was not a woman of grand gestures or elaborate affection. She showed love through consistency, a plate of food always made, a bed always clean, a door always unlocked. And Sabrina, who had learned not to ask for much, found that this was more than enough. It was in Winnie's house that Sabrina had first understood what it felt like to be useful rather than simply present. She had cooked when Winnie was overwhelmed. She had helped the younger children with their lessons. She had quietly fixed things: a leaking pipe, a stuck window, a misfiled school enrollment form, without being asked and without expecting recognition. It was simply who she was. Now, at the cedar work table, she made a small notation in the margin of her attendance sheet and turned to the next page. The Harvest Moon ceremony was the most significant social and political event in the Ironvale calendar, a night when alliances were renewed, when pack rankings were formally acknowledged, and when the moon occasionally, if the old stories were to be believed, revealed fated mates to those she deemed ready. Sabrina had coordinated the last 3 ceremonies. She had managed the catering schedules, the seating arrangements for visiting dignitaries, the ceremonial candle order, the territorial map displays. She had done all of this from the background, clipboard in hand, visible to everyone and noticed by no one. She told herself this was fine. She was mostly successful at believing it. Not the archive door burst open with a cheerful violence that sent 3 scrolls rolling off the nearest shelf. "Sabrina Mills, if you are still in that dress, I will lose my entire mind." Jayene Finch came through the door like weather, bright, warm, and completely unavoidable. She was 24, the pack's junior communications officer, and Sabrina's closest and only true friend. She had a garment bag over one shoulder, 2 borrowed hairpins clamped between her teeth, and the expression of someone who had been planning this intervention for at least a week. "I'm almost done with the catering cross-reference," Sabrina said, not looking up. "The catering cross-reference," Jayene repeated, setting the garment bag down with enormous care and removing the pins from her teeth. "Will still exist tomorrow. You, on the other hand, will have exactly 40 minutes before the ceremony begins, and your hair is doing that thing where it forgets it's supposed to be hair." Sabrina touched her hair instinctively. "It's fine." "It is the opposite of fine." Jayene had already unzipped the garment bag. Inside was a deep sage green dress, simple, well-made, quietly lovely. Sabrina blinked at it. "Where did you get that?" "I borrowed it from Leona Voss. She owes me for covering her archive intake shift in February." Jayene held it up. "It will fit. Don't argue." Sabrina didn't argue. She rarely did with Jayene, partly because Jayene was almost always right, and partly because arguing with Jayene required an energy investment that Sabrina found she didn't have the reserves for today. As Jayene worked on her hair with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before, her voice dropped into the softer register she reserved for things that actually mattered. "He's going to be there tonight, you know." Sabrina kept her eyes on the lamp. "I know." "Bess." "I know who you meant, Jane." He was asking about the ceremonial seating plan last week, specifically where the records team would be positioned. Sabrina said nothing. Jayene set the hairpin down and looked at her friend's reflection in the small mirror propped against the archive shelf. "Sabrina, it's okay to hope for something. I'm not hoping for anything. You've been in love with him since you were 16. That's not the same as hoping." Jayene studied her for a moment, with the quiet, perceptive eyes of someone who knew exactly what the difference was and chose, kindly, not to press it. But Bess Doolin had been the unspoken architecture of Sabrina's interior world for 7 years. She had never told him. She had never told anyone, really. Only Jane, and only in the roundabout way of someone who mentions something once, and then immediately changes the subject. He was the pack's beta heir, tall, broad-shouldered, with pale green eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been designed specifically to make the younger pack females forget what they were doing. He was also, in Sabrina's honest private assessment, not especially deep. He was charming when he wanted to be, capable when pushed, and fundamentally shaped by his father's ambitions in ways he had never quite examined. But there had been moments, quiet ones, an afternoon in the archive 2 years ago, when he had come to retrieve a land deed and stayed for an hour asking her questions about the territorial history. Genuinely curious, genuinely engaged, looking at her like she was interesting rather than useful. A long glance over the attendance register at last year's ceremony that had lasted a breath too long to be accidental. Small things. The kind of small things that a woman who had spent her whole life noticing what other people overlooked had filed quietly away and tried not to build too much upon. She stood up and let Jayan finish with her hair. "Ready?" Jayan asked, stepping back to look at her. Sabrina picked up her notebook and her pen. She looked at the archive, the warm, lamp-lit room that had been her truest home for 12 years. She looked at the harvest moon, enormous and gold outside the narrow window. "It's a good moon tonight," Jayan said softly, following her gaze. "Yes," Sabrina agreed. "I hope so." They walked toward the lit great hall together. Sabrina did not let herself think about what she was hoping for. She simply walked. That was the thing about Sabrina Mills. She always kept moving, even when she was afraid, even when she was uncertain, even when the ground felt unstable beneath her careful, steady feet. She had learned, the hard way, that standing still was where the grief found you. So she kept moving. She had no way of knowing, walking toward those warm lit doors on that golden October evening, that by the time the night was over, the entire shape of her life would have changed beyond any map she had ever filed, any record she had ever kept, any boundary she had ever charted. She had no way of knowing that the moon she had just admired through the archive window had, in fact, been watching her back, and that it had plans. The great hall of the Iron Vale Pack estate was, on the night of the harvest moon ceremony, genuinely beautiful. Sabrina could acknowledge this objectively, even while she was monitoring the catering timeline, directing servers, and making quiet notes about the East Wing sound system that had developed an intermittent crackle during the opening address. The hall had been dressed in cedar garlands and white flowers, and the 50 ivory candles along the stone windowsills threw a warm, amber gold light across the polished oak floors and the assembled pack. 200 wolves in their finest clothes, or filling the long tables and the standing spaces around the edges with a particular kind of festive, charged energy that only the harvest moon brought out. This was the night the moon spoke. Everyone felt it, even if they wouldn't say so directly. Even the most pragmatic wolves in the pack, the ones who managed lumber contracts and trade agreements and spoke about spirituality with the careful skepticism of people who privately believed in it entirely, moved through the hall tonight with a particular alertness, a particular readiness. The moon had her own agenda. Sabrina had learned, coordinating 3 of these ceremonies, that the harvest moon ceremony had a dual nature that the pack's official programming never quite acknowledged. On the surface, it was a political event. Alliances renewed, rankings affirmed, to the pack's elite displaying their relationships and their power to one another with the refined efficiency of people who had been doing this for generations. Underneath that surface ran something older and considerably less manageable. The pull of the moon on the bond between fated mates was strongest on this night. Werewolves who had been circling their other half for months sometimes found the thread between them suddenly, undeniably taut on this particular evening, visible, physical, and entirely impossible to pretend wasn't there. Sabrina had watched it happen to other people at the last 2 ceremonies. She had observed the moment from her position at the edge of the room with the careful, slightly wistful attention of someone watching something extraordinary happen to someone else. She had told herself she was fine with that. She was managing to believe it right up until the moment the scent hit her. She was mid-sentence, directing a young catering server named Anna Cross about the champagne tower placement, when the air in the room changed. It was not a smell exactly, Or rather, it was a smell the way a sunrise was a color. It was overwhelming and specific, and entirely unlike anything else in the world. Cedar bark and warm amber, and clean, rain-soaked earth, ancient and alive, and pointed directly at her like a compass finding north. The pen slipped out of her fingers. She didn't notice it fall. Her inner wolf, the quiet creature she had spent 23 years coexisting with in a kind of polite, muted partnership, rose in her chest like a tide coming in. Not aggressive, not frightened, just enormous, and certain, and suddenly, completely awake. Mate, or the word moved through her like a bell being struck. Her eyes moved across the room of their own accord, pulled by something older than choice, and found Bess Doolin standing 20 feet away, near the entrance to the main corridor. He had frozen. The easy, practiced charm he wore at pack events, like a well-fitted coat, had simply stopped. His pale green eyes were locked on her face, and in them was an expression Sabrina had never seen on him before. Not the warmth she had noticed in the archive, not the social ease he deployed so naturally in public. This was something raw and less voluntary. Wonder, recognition, the expression of a man feeling the floor shift beneath him, and not yet knowing whether it was going to hold. The invisible thread of the mate bond pulled taut between them with a force that made her breath catch. Out around them, the ceremony continued for approximately 4 more seconds before the pack began to feel it. The ambient noise dropped. Conversations trailed into silence. People shifted, instinctively, to create a clear line of sight between the unranked records keeper and the beta heir. 200 people holding their breath. Sabrina took 1 step forward. Her hands were trembling. For one extraordinary, fragile, luminous moment, Bess Doolin looked back at her. Really looked at her, the way she had always privately hoped he would. And something in his expression said yes. Then his father moved. Ralph Doolin had been standing near the stone fireplace with a glass in his hand and the particular stillness of a man who had been waiting for something. When the mate bond ignited across the room, when every head turned and the air charged with its ancient electricity, Ralph's eyes moved from his son's face to Sabrina's figure, her simple dress, her modest notebook, her complete and utter absence of rank, title, or political value, with the flat, assessing speed of an accountant reviewing a loss. He looked back at his son. It was a single look. No words. Just the weight of every conversation they had ever had about the future of the Doolin bloodline, the Haskins alliance, the northern trade routes, and what kind of Luna the next alpha of Ironvale required, compressed into 2 seconds of eye contact. Bess blinked. The wonder in his face did not disappear all at once. It withdrew, the way light withdraws from a room when a cloud crosses the sun, gradually, and then completely. What replaced it was something Sabrina recognized, or even though she had never seen it directed at her before. Calculation. Lorelei Haskins stood at Bess's left side, tall, immaculate, effortlessly gorgeous in a gown of deep champagne gold that caught the candlelight and held it. She had the kind of beauty that was partly bone structure, and partly the assurance of someone who had always been told they were extraordinary and had simply decided to believe it. Her eyes moved between Bess and Sabrina with the narrow, intelligent focus of someone doing arithmetic. She tightened her grip on Bess's arm by a fraction. It was such a small gesture, such a quiet, proprietary, deliberate gesture. Sabrina saw it. She understood it completely. She took a breath. She was still taking that breath, still managing the hope, still telling herself that she was wrong about what she was seeing in Bess's face, or still holding on to the last edge of that luminous, fragile moment, when Bess stepped forward and the ceremony fell into total silence. Sabrina Mills. Her name in his voice, She had imagined hearing it differently, on a night like this, under a moon like this. She had imagined warmth in it. There was no warmth. "Bess!" Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Please." He didn't falter. He had clearly decided, in those few seconds between his father's look and this moment, that hesitation would be worse. That clean and quick was the kindest version of what he was about to do. He was wrong about that. But he didn't know it yet. "You are unranked," Bess said, and his voice carried across the silent hall with the clear, flat projection of someone reciting something they have prepared. "You carry no bloodline of standing, no alliance, and no future that serves this pack. I need a partner who can stand in the light beside me, not someone who files paperwork in the dark." The words landed in the silence with an almost physical weight. From somewhere to Sabrina's left, she heard Jaeen make a sharp, involuntary sound. She heard Isaac Lamber, the pack's senior enforcer, quietly and firmly take Jaeen's arm, because no one, however justified their outrage, could interfere in mate business. Not even for this. Sabrina did not look at Jaeen. She did not look at Ralph Doolin, who was exhaling slowly by the fireplace. She did not look at Lorelei Haskins, who was rearranging her expression into something that aspired to sympathy, and landed considerably short. She looked at Bess. She looked at him clearly and directly, or the way she looked at things in the archive that needed to be accurately assessed before they could be correctly filed. She looked at him, and she understood, in the sudden, clarifying way of someone whose hope has just been definitively resolved, exactly what he was. Not a villain, not a monster, just a man who had been taught, his whole life, that some things were worth more than others, and who had never been given any reason to question the list. The bond-breaking was physical. She had heard it described before, in the old records, in the testimony documents she had filed after rare, disputed cases. She had read the clinical language of severed soul ties with the detached professionalism of an archivist. She had not understood, reading those documents, the reality of what the words were describing. The hollow feeling opened in the center of her chest like a door being pulled off its hinges. The numbness moved outward from her sternum to her shoulders, down her arms, into her fingertips, until she was standing in her own body, the way you stand in a room after all the furniture has been removed, recognizing the space without recognizing what it felt like to inhabit it. The thin, warm trace at her upper lip was the only outward sign. The physical manifestation of something sacred being severed without consent. She wiped it away with the back of her hand. She straightened, vertebra by vertebra. She lifted her chin. The silence in the hall was absolute. 200 people watching. Some with pity that felt like another wound. Some with the guilty, grateful relief of people glad it wasn't them. There were a few, the ones who had always found it useful to remember that Sabrina Mills was lower ranked and therefore manageable, with something that lived uncomfortably close to satisfaction. Sabrina looked at none of them. She found her voice in the center of herself, in the same quiet place where she had always found the things she needed to keep going, and she spoke clearly. "I, Sabrina Mills, accept your rejection, Bess Doolin. I hope the life you have chosen is worth the price you just paid for it." Not a threat, not a curse. Just the plain, honest truth of someone who understood, with absolute clarity, that the cost of what had just happened would eventually find its way to the person who had chosen it. She turned. She walked. Her heels made no sound on the oak floor. She kept her eyes fixed on the iron-hinged doors at the far end of the hall. She counted her steps in her head, not to manage the pain, but because counting was the thing her mind did when it needed something concrete to hold on to. 10, 9, 8. The hollow feeling in her chest was enormous. The cold was spreading up from her fingers into her wrists, and she could feel her inner wolf sitting very still in the center of her. Not howling, not fighting, just present. Just there. A steady, quiet, grieving warmth in the middle of everything that was going numb. 6 steps. 5. She just needed to reach the doors. She just needed the cold, honest air outside. She just needed one single moment when nobody was watching her be strong. 4 steps. Then every candle in the hall bent in the same direction at once. The oak floor vibrated beneath her feet, a deep, resonant tremor that traveled upward through her bones. The temperature in the room dropped by several degrees in approximately 3 seconds. The sound of the outside night, the wind in the pines, the distant mountain creek, the ordinary October darkness, ceased entirely, replaced by a weighted, electric silence that was not silence at all but pressure. Sabrina stopped walking. Her inner wolf, which had been sitting still and grieving a moment ago, was now doing something entirely different. Every instinct she possessed, every animal, ancient, deeply embedded instinct, was sending the same message with an urgency she had never felt before in her life. Pay attention. Something is here. Something is what the iron doors did not so much open as yield, the way things yield to forces that do not require permission. They swung inward with a sound like a slow, inevitable exhale, and the cold mountain air that moved through them carried a scent that erased everything else in the room. Rich mahogany, dark cedar, and something underneath both of those things. Something ancient and overwhelming, and entirely impossible to categorize except as power. The kind of power that was not performed or cultivated or displayed, the kind that simply existed, the way mountains existed, the way gravity existed, as a fundamental condition of the world. Every wolf in the hall felt it simultaneously, and every wolf in the hall, every alpha, every beta, but every enforcer and elder and political player who had spent decades cultivating their position and their strength, sank to their knees. Not by choice, by nature. Marmon Richmond did not announce himself. He had never needed to. The 3 black armored vehicles in the estate's circular driveway were the first indication, but only for the few people near enough to the windows to see them before the presence arrived. For everyone else, the first indication was the pressure. The bone-deep, ancient, involuntary pressure of an aura that had taken 34 years and 7 conquered territories to build, pressing into the hall like weather moving through a mountain pass, quiet, overwhelming, and entirely indifferent to whether you were ready for it. His security entered first, 4 of them, moving with the tight, depredatory synchronization of people who had trained together long enough that individual decision-making had become a collective reflex. They swept the room in under 10 seconds, threat assessment, exit points, structural weaknesses, and found nothing worth pausing for. They took their positions. Then Dermin Brock stepped through the doors. Marmon's beta was broad-shouldered and heavily scarred, with the quiet, methodical watchfulness of a man who had spent 20 years reading rooms so his king didn't have to. He moved to the right of the entrance and stood there, still, observant, and radiating a contained authority that, on any other night and in any other company, would have been the most commanding presence in the building. Tonight, he was the introduction. Marmon Richmond stepped through the iron doors, and the hall understood, was in the way that something very old and very true makes itself understood, not through words or performance, but through simple, undeniable fact that the most powerful alpha in the eastern reaches had arrived. He was exceptionally tall, broad-shouldered in the way of someone built for endurance rather than display, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark coat that sat on him with the understated precision of someone who had long since stopped needing clothing to communicate anything. His hair was black, swept back from a face that was striking rather than conventionally handsome. Strong jaw, clean lines, the particular quality of stillness that settled around people who had learned to make every movement deliberate, because every movement had consequences. His eyes were gold, not amber, not hazel, not the warm approximation of gold that some wolves carried in the flash of their shift. They were the deep, genuine gold of something molten that had cooled into certainty, and they moved across the great hall of the Ironvale Pack Estate with the calm, unhurried assessment of someone who had walked into more rooms than this and found fewer of them worth his full attention. He had come to Ironvale on council business, a territorial boundary review, the kind of administrative audit that a king of his standing technically didn't need to conduct personally, but which Marmon Richmond conducted himself because he had learned, over 14 years of ruling the Eastern Reaches, that the things other people described as routine were frequently the things that mattered most. He had not expected this night to be anything other than ordinary, or he stepped fully across the threshold, and stopped. It happened the way it happened in the old stories, the ones Sabrina had read in the archive's oldest collection, filed under historical mate bond documentation, written in the careful, slightly awed handwriting of pack scribes who had tried to find clinical language for something that resisted every clinical framing. Marmon's head came up. His nostrils flared. Once, slowly, and something in his expression shifted in a way that Dermin Brock, watching from 2 feet to his right, had never seen in 14 years of service. The cold, contained authority didn't disappear. It simply opened. The way a fist opens. The way a door opens. Something that had been held tightly for a very long time, releasing all at once in the direction of a single point in the room. His gold eyes swept the hall with sudden, sharp, specific focus. Past the kneeling pack members, past the overturned champagne glass someone had dropped when their knees gave out, past the ceremonial moon altar and the cedar garlands, and the frozen, stunned face of Ralph Doolin pressed to the floor near the fireplace, until they found Sabrina Mills. She was pressed against the cold stone wall beside the iron doors, one hand braced against it, as though the floor had shifted beneath her. Her sage-green dress was simple and unadorned, her leather notebook clutched to her chest, her face pale, and her eyes still bright with the contained, determined composure of someone who had just absorbed something enormous and was refusing, on pure principle, to let it break her posture. There was a faint trace of drying warmth on the back of her hand. Marmon looked at her the way people look at things they were not expecting to find, with the arrested, wondering quality of someone who has just discovered that the world contains something they didn't know they had been looking for. He crossed the hall in 4 strides. The kneeling pack members shifted instinctively to create a path, pressing closer to the floor as he passed, not out of performance but out of the animal, involuntary response to an aura at full, unheld extension. Several of the Omegas had their foreheads touching the oak floor. Even Isaac Lambert, 30 years an enforcer and not a man given to displays of submission, had both knees down. Marmon stopped in front of Sabrina. Up close, the power rolling off him was extraordinary. Not aggressive, not threatening, just enormous. Otway standing at the base of a mountain was not threatening, but was absolutely and inescapably something you felt in your whole body. Sabrina looked up at him. She was not on her knees. She had not gone down with the rest of the room, not because she was resisting, but because the wall had caught her first, and she had simply stayed where she was, braced against it, looking up at the Alpha King of the Eastern Reaches, with eyes that were clear and startled and direct. Marmon looked down at her. He was trembling. It was almost imperceptible. The faintest, fine tremor in the hands he raised and then held suspended, just short of her face, hovering millimeters from her cheekbones, not quite touching, as though contact were something that required her permission before it could be his. The feared, reclusive, utterly sovereign Alpha King of the Eastern Reaches, trembling. The bond between them ignited at close range with a force that made Sabrina's breath leave her body entirely. It was nothing like the thread that had snapped with Bess, that had felt like a suggestion, a possibility, a door that might have opened. This was not a door. This was the entire structure of the building. This was not something the universe was offering. It was something the universe was declaring. "Mate," Marmon said. His voice was low, a deep, resonant murmur that Sabrina felt in her sternum, in the hollow place where something had been carved out 20 minutes ago. The word was not a question. It was recognition. It was the word for something he had understood in his bones the moment he crossed the threshold, now finding its way to his voice. "Well, my true mate." Sabrina stared up at him. Her mind was moving very slowly, the way minds move when too many large things are happening too close together. The hollow feeling in her chest was still there, but alongside it now, something entirely different was happening. A warmth, a deep, spreading, bone-settling warmth moving outward from her sternum in the exact opposite direction as the cold had gone, filling the spaces that had just been emptied with something that felt like... She would think about this for a long time afterward, and never quite find a better word for it. Home. Marmon inhaled slowly, his gold eyes closing for just a moment. When they opened, they were darker. He had smelled it. Beneath her scent, warm vanilla and old parchment, and the particular clean dryness of archive air, the unmistakable, sharp, agonizing trace of a severed soul tie. Recent. Still raw, the spiritual equivalent of an open wound. Someone had hurt her. Someone had broken something sacred with his mate not 20 minutes ago in this very room before he had walked through the doors. The warmth in Marmon's expression did not disappear. It stayed, resident and certain, in the part of him that was now oriented entirely toward Sabrina. But over it, and around it, and spreading outward from it into the hall, something else arrived. The temperature in the room dropped another 4 degrees. A crystal glass on a nearby table cracked cleanly down its center. Not dropped, not struck, simply cracked, the way glass cracks under sudden, sustained pressure. Marmon turned his head slowly toward the kneeling room. "Who?" he said in the quiet, the precise voice of someone giving the world exactly one chance to respond correctly. "Did this to my mate." The silence that followed was not the silence of people who didn't know. It was the silence of 200 people who knew exactly and were calculating, with great speed and varying degrees of self-preservation, what the correct response was. Ralph Doolin, his forehead 6 inches from the oak floor, made the involuntary mistake of glancing toward his son. Marmon tracked the glance. His gold eyes found Bess Doolin, still on his knees near the ceremonial stage, his face the particular grey colour of a man watching a consequence arrive. And the cold, predatory focus that settled onto Bess was the kind that didn't waver and didn't rush. A slow, terrible calm crossed Marmon Richmond's face. "You," he said, and began to walk forward. But the walk across the hall was not fast. That was the part that no one who was present would forget. Not the confrontation itself, not the words, not even what came after. What they remembered in the months and years that followed was the walk. The slow, deliberate, entirely unhurried pace of Marmon Richmond crossing the Ironvale Great Hall toward Bess Doolin, with the particular quality of movement that belonged to someone who had all the time in the world and intended to use every second of it. Bess did not run. His inner wolf would not allow it. The submission response to the king's aura was not something he could override through pride or will, and he had just enough dignity left to understand that attempting it would only make what was coming considerably worse. He stayed on his knees. He straightened his spine marginally. He raised his pale green eyes to meet the approach of the man who was, with every step, becoming more terrifying by virtue of becoming more calm. Marmon stopped directly in front of him, looked down. The silence stretched. Somewhere across the hall, one of the younger Omegas was crying very quietly. Nobody moved to comfort them. Nobody moved at all. "You stood before your pack," Marmon said, "before the moon herself, and severed a soul tie with the woman the universe chose for me." Bess swallowed. "Tell me, what exactly did you believe you were gaining?" And there was the trap of it, because Bess had to answer. Protocol required it, the king had asked directly, and the small remaining operational part of Bess's dignity understood that the only currency he had left in this moment was honesty. "Alliance," he said. His voice was steady, ought to his credit. "My father. The pack needs the Haskins trade routes. She had nothing to offer. She kept every land deed this pack has filed for 30 years. Marmon did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. Each word arrived with the weight of something placed deliberately rather than thrown. "She resolved 3 boundary disputes through documentation, when your enforcers couldn't resolve them through negotiation. She managed your pack's territorial records with a precision that prevented 2 federal land challenges. She kept your pack financially organized during the last economic downturn, through investment strategies your father's advisors never thought to implement." Bess stared at him. "She did all of this, invisibly, without acknowledgement, without adequate compensation, and without a title that reflected her actual value to this pack. And you stood in front of her and told her she filed paperwork in the dark." Marmon let that settle. She was the only light in this building worth anything. The hall was so quiet that the candles were audible, the tiny, steady sound of 50 flames holding their shape in the still air. Ralph Doolin, still pressed to the floor 3 meters away, made no sound. No defense. He had heard the accounting of what his political calculation had cost his son, laid out by the most powerful wolf in the eastern reaches, and the math was not in his favor. Lorelei Haskins had moved, sometime during the walk across the hall, to a position considerably closer to the far wall. Her expression was the careful, the composed blankness of someone whose next move depended entirely on how the next 60 seconds unfolded. Marmon crouched down so he was level with Bess, close, unhurried, those gold eyes level and completely certain. "You threw away a diamond," he said softly, "because you were afraid it wouldn't match the furniture." He stood. His hand moved. "Marmon." The voice was quiet, steady. It came from behind him, from the direction of the iron doors, and it cut through the charged electric air of the hall with the particular quality of something that was not commanding and not afraid, but was simply clear, like a tuning fork being struck, like a line being drawn. Marmon went still. He turned his head. Sabrina had stepped away from the wall. She was standing in the center of the space, between the doors and the hall, small and upright in her sage green dress, her notebook still held against her chest, her chin still up. She was looking at him directly, the way she had looked at him when he first crossed the hall, with startled clarity, with eyes that were not performing bravery, but simply, genuinely, were not afraid of him. "Please," she said. "Don't." The gold in Marmon's eyes pulsed once, deeply. He lowered his hand. Behind him, Bess exhaled with the shaking, desperate relief of someone who has just been reprieved from something they very much deserved. Marmon walked back across the hall toward Sabrina. As he moved, the quality of his presence shifted in a way that was almost visible, the cold authority not disappearing but stepping back, like weather clearing, and something warmer and more personal taking its place. When he stopped in front of her, he was close enough that she had to tilt her chin up to meet his eyes, and the bond between them hummed in the air between their faces with a warmth that was entirely different from the cold electricity of the last 20 minutes. "He hurt you," Marmon said quietly, low enough that only she could hear. "He will pay for that, Sabrina." "He will," she agreed, her voice soft and steady. "But I will not have my new life start with his humiliation on the floor. He isn't worth that kind of beginning." Marmon looked at her for a long, still moment. Something moved across his face. Something private and genuine and entirely unguarded. The expression of a man discovering that the person standing in front of him is not what he expected, but is precisely, was exactly what he needed. "As you wish," he said. He turned back to the room. His voice, when it carried to the full hall, was the calm, absolute voice of a king delivering a verdict that would not be revisited. "The Iron Veil Pact's grain trade routes through the eastern reaches are suspended, effective immediately, pending a full territorial audit by my council. All trade agreements signed in the last 3 years will be reviewed. Ralph Doolin's financial accounts are frozen pending that review." Ralph Doolin made a sound against the floor, something between a protest and a sob. Nobody moved to acknowledge it. "Furthermore," Marmon scanned the room, every kneeling face, every averted eye. "If I receive a single report of any member of this pack speaking disrespectfully of Sabrina Mills, of her rank, her work, her worth, or her name, I will return, and I will not be in as reasonable a mood as I am tonight." Then Jayene Finch broke from the crowd. Isaac Lambert let her go this time, because Sabrina was no longer in a mate bond dispute, and because even Isaac Lambert understood that there were moments when protocol had to yield to something more fundamental. Jayene crossed the hall in 11 steps and wrapped both arms around Sabrina with a ferocity that was, by any reasonable measure, too tight and absolutely correct. "You come back to visit me," Jayene said, against Sabrina's hair, her voice fierce and a little unsteady. "You hear me? Every single month." "Every month," Sabrina promised, her arms tight around her friend. "I promise." She pulled back. She looked at Jayene's face, her bright, loyal, genuinely furious on Sabrina's behalf face, and felt, or for the first time since the pen had fallen out of her fingers earlier in the evening, something that was not grief. Gratitude. Real, deep, specific gratitude for the fact that this particular person had chosen her. Marmon, standing one respectful step behind Sabrina, met Jayene's eyes over her friend's shoulder. Jayene's gaze was direct and assessing, the look of someone who loved Sabrina Mills without conditions and intended to communicate clearly that the same standard now applied to anyone who claimed the right to stand beside her. Marmon held that gaze. "She will come back," he said quietly. "Every month. You have my word." Jayene held his gaze for another 3 seconds, long enough to communicate that she was not intimidated by his title, and that his word had better be the kind that held. Then she gave one firm nod. Marmon offered his hand to Sabrina. She looked at it for a moment, this large, steady, scarred hand, belonging to the most powerful and most solitary man in the eastern reaches, extended to her in the middle of the hall, where, 20 minutes ago, she had been told she was not worth the light. She took it. His fingers closed around hers with a gentleness that was entirely disproportionate to his size, and entirely proportionate to how carefully it was becoming clear he intended to handle this particular thing. They walked toward the doors together. Sabrina kept her chin up. She did not look back. She had filed what needed to be filed about this place, and she had learned a long time ago, that looking back at the things that had already been correctly stored was a waste of the present. She looked forward, into the cold, to clean mountain night, into the gold eyes of the man walking beside her, whose hand was warm around hers, who had arrived on what was supposed to be the worst night of her life, and had, simply completely, without asking permission from the universe or anyone in it, changed everything. Outside, the harvest moon was enormous and steady and entirely pleased with itself. The drive north took 4 hours. The convoy moved through the Oregon mountains in the particular silence of late-night travel. The world dark beyond the tinted windows, the trees dense and close on either side of the road, the mountain air cold and clean and faintly sharp with pine resin. Inside the lead vehicle, the leather interior was warm, and the road noise was a low, constant undertone beneath the quiet. Sabrina sat beside Marmon in the back of the armored vehicle, with their hands resting loosely together on the seat between them. Neither of them had orchestrated this. It had simply arrived, the way the bond itself had arrived, without fanfare and without requiring discussion. The new mate bond was tender and overwhelming in equal measure. It sat in Sabrina's chest like something that had always been there and had simply, finally, been given permission to be known. It demanded proximity, not in an aggressive way, but in the way a long-held breath demands release. Being within arm's reach of him eased something in her she hadn't fully realized was tense. Dermin Brock rode in the front passenger seat, maintaining a diplomatic silence that was, Sabrina suspected, partly professional discretion and partly genuine understanding of the situation. After a while, Marmon began to talk. Not to impress, yet not to fill silence. He talked the way he did everything else, deliberately, and because he had decided to. He described his territory, the 7 PAC regions under his jurisdiction, the river trade networks that ran through the valley systems, the Council's ongoing disputes about boundary maintenance, and the humanitarian infrastructure his compound funded in the outlying human communities. He talked about the complexity of governing wolves who had been isolated for decades and were now navigating the intersection of PAC law and human civilization. He talked about it with the matter-of-fact frankness of someone who found the work genuinely interesting and had simply not had many people to discuss it with who were both capable of following the conversation and secure enough in themselves not to treat it as an opportunity to perform. Dear Sabrina listened. She asked questions, real ones, the kind that came from someone who had been thinking about territorial economics for years and had simply never been in a room with anyone who wanted to hear what she thought about them. "Your Eastern River levy," she said at one point, half to herself, watching the dark forest blur past the window. "If the current grain indices are what the regional report suggested last quarter, you're undercharging by somewhere between 10 and 13%. In the front seat, Dermin turned around slowly. He looked at Sabrina. He looked at Marmon. He looked back at Sabrina. Marmon's hand tightened fractionally around hers. "How do you know the regional reports?" "Cross-territorial trade documentation," she said simply. "I've been filing the comparative records for 3 years. At Iron Vale's Eastern agreements referenced your levy rates as a baseline. I noticed the index discrepancy 18 months ago." Silence. "Did you tell anyone?" Marmon asked. "I filed a notation in the cross-reference ledger." "Did anyone read it?" "Almost certainly not." Marmon was quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, "That notation just saved the Eastern Reaches approximately 4 million in undercharged trade revenue." "Closer to 4.3, Sabrina said, "depending on the third quarter adjustment." Dermin turned back around to face the road. Sabrina could see, even from the back seat, that he was smiling. Marmon looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the particular quality of a man who keeps encountering something extraordinary in the same place, and is still, every single time. They're genuinely startled by it. They arrived at Thornwall Keep as the sun was beginning its first hesitant suggestion over the eastern ridge of the mountains. Calling it a compound was, Sabrina thought, the way you might call the ocean a large puddle, technically defensible and entirely missing the point. The keep rose from the mountainside with the particular authority of something that had been built to last rather than built to impress, though it managed both without apparent effort. Dark timber and pale stone and vast panels of glass that caught the first light of the coming morning and held it, the whole structure integrated into the cliff face as though the mountain had grown it rather than humans built it. The river valley below was silver in the early light, but the pine forest spread in every direction like something that had never been interrupted. The gates opened as they approached. Pack members had gathered on the wide stone steps, dozens of them, alerted by Dermin's advance communication, standing in the cold pre-dawn, with the particular mix of curiosity and contained excitement of people who have just been told something unprecedented has occurred. At the front of the gathered pack stood Winnie Conway, the keep's den mother, a sturdy, sharp-eyed woman with silver-streaked hair and the warm, no-nonsense authority of someone who managed a household of 40 people through the simple principle of high standards applied with genuine affection, or she had a thick shawl wrapped around her shoulders and an expression that suggested she had already formed 3 opinions and was deciding which one to lead with. When Sabrina stepped out of the vehicle, Winnie Conway looked at her. Really looked, with the instinctive assessment of someone who read people the way Sabrina read documents. And then she did something that surprised everyone present, including Sabrina. She smiled, fully and immediately, the way people smile at things they have been waiting for, without knowing it. She curtsied, deep and sincere. "Welcome home, Luna." Sabrina stood on the stone courtyard of Thornwall Keep in her borrowed sage-green dress, with the cold mountain air on her face and the harvest moon still pale in the western sky, and felt the word home land in her chest like a key, finding a lock she had forgotten she was carrying. Later, after Winnie had pressed warm food into Sabrina's hands and shown her to a suite so warm and spacious and full of quiet, genuine comfort that Sabrina had to stand in the doorway for a full 10 seconds before she could make herself walk through it. Marmon took her to the archive. The keep's private archive occupied the north wing's lower level, a long, high-ceilinged room with temperature-controlled shelving, amber glass lamps, and the particular hushed quality of serious, well-tended spaces. The collection was extraordinary. Centuries of territorial documentation, bloodline records, council meeting transcripts, boundary surveys, historical maps drawn on materials Sabrina recognized as irreplaceable. Marmon opened the door and stepped back. Sabrina walked in. She stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, her eyes moving over the shelves with the focused, reverent attention she reserved for things of genuine importance. Her fingers moved almost involuntarily toward the spines of the nearest ledgers, not quite touching, cataloguing, assessing, recognizing. Marmon watched her from the doorway. There was something in his expression that was not quite wonder, and not quite recognition, but lived in the territory between them. The expression of a man looking at a room he has walked past 1,000 times, and suddenly, for the first time, understanding what it was for. "It hasn't been properly cross-indexed," Sabrina said softly, not looking up. "No," he agreed. "The territorial maps in this section should be organized by acquisition date, not alphabetical region. It creates a false impression of the boundary development sequence." "I know." She looked at him over her shoulder. "You know, I've been waiting," he said simply, "for someone who would care about that." The quiet that followed was warm and specific. The quiet of 2 people who have just discovered that they have been, without knowing it, building toward the same thing. Hundreds of miles south, In the Iron Vale Pack estate, the great hall had been cleared, and the ceremonial candles had been extinguished. The guests had gone home. The estate was quiet. Bess Doolin sat at Sabrina's old work table in the archive room, surrounded by the documents she had left behind, a lamp burning low beside him. His father had been on the phone for 6 hours straight with lawyers, financial advisors, and allied pack contacts, trying to assess the damage. The damage was extensive. The Haskins alliance had dissolved on the car ride home. Lorelei had sent a single formal text before her father's lawyers sent a more formal letter. The grain trade suspension meant the pack's primary revenue stream was gone. The financial audit meant nothing in the accounts was safe. Bess stared at the territorial ledgers in front of him, the careful, precise, beautifully organized records that Sabrina had built and maintained for years. He had pulled them out because he needed to understand what the King's audit team would find, and as he worked through them, page by page, he began to understand something that made his chest feel hollow in a way he hadn't expected. She had been extraordinary. She had been extraordinary the entire time, right here, in this room, in this building, doing this work. And he had looked at her standing across the hall with the entire weight of the moon's recognition between them, and his first complete, coherent thought had been about trade routes. He picked up his phone. He stared at it for a long time. Then he dialed a number he had used once before, Resno Turlo, a disgraced former council records auditor, who had a particular expertise in making documents say whatever his clients needed them to say. The call connected on the second ring. "I need someone discredited," Bess said quietly, "before the council audit reaches the keep. In the mountain compound, 400 miles north, in the warm amber light of an archive that was already, but in Sabrina's careful mental organization, beginning to rearrange itself into what it should have always been, Marmon Richmond sat in the doorway with his back against the frame, watching his mate read, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the world was exactly the right size. Wyatt Hobbs didn't knock. He had worked for Marmon Richmond for 11 years, and in that time he had developed a precise, unspoken understanding of the difference between situations that warranted a knock and situations that warranted simply appearing. This was the second kind. He placed the sealed document folder on the edge of Marmon's desk, with the particular care of someone setting down something that was going to cause significant problems. "We have a situation," Wyatt said. His voice was the flat, or professional voice of a man delivering information he wished he didn't have. "It involves the Luna." Marmon had been reviewing Eastern Boundary contracts. He set down his pen. He opened the folder. The document inside was a formal complaint filed with the Eastern Council, signed by Bess Doolin and submitted through a council-appointed arbitration service in Portland. It alleged that Sabrina Mills, acting in her capacity as records keeper for the Iron Vale Pack, had spent 3 years deliberately falsifying territorial boundary documents, manipulating land agreements to benefit unnamed outside parties, and had fled the pack with sensitive documentation when she left with the Alpha King. The supporting evidence was detailed: digital access logs, metadata timestamps, and a paper trail routed through Sabrina's old archive terminal with the clinical precision of someone who understood exactly how documentation fraud was supposed to look. Marmon read it once. Then he read it again. When he looked up, his eyes were very dark and very still, the stillness of deep water rather than the stillness of ice, more dangerous in its way than obvious anger. "I will go to Iron Vale today," he said, standing. "Marmon." His name in her voice, from the doorway. Sabrina stood at the threshold of the office, her reading glasses pushed up on her head, a cross-reference ledger under her arm, having arrived for their morning working session to find Wyatt's expression, and correctly identified it as the expression of a problem she needed to understand before anyone made any decisions. She walked to the desk, so she read the document. She read it carefully, the way she read everything, not scanning, not skimming, but reading with the full, methodical attention of someone who understood that the important thing was always in the detail. When she set it down, her expression was composed. Her eyes were clear. She looked like someone who has just received a challenge in a language they are entirely fluent in. "Sit down," she said to Marmon. Wyatt made a very small sound, not quite a cough, not quite a laugh. He pressed his lips together. Marmon looked at her. The darkness in his eyes did not disappear, but something else arrived alongside it. That quality she had already learned to recognize. The quality of a man who keeps being presented with evidence that the person in front of him is more than he expected, and keeps choosing to be genuinely, quietly delighted by it rather than threatened. He sat. "Bess isn't fighting with claws," Sabrina said, pulling the folder toward her and setting it beside her ledger with the brisk efficiency of someone organizing a workspace. "He's fighting with paper, and paper," she looked up, "is my territory." She turned to Wyatt. "I need full access to the Keep's forensic documentation system. Every piece of software you use for digital authentication and metadata analysis. And I need coffee. Actual coffee, not that herbal thing Winnie keeps trying to give me." "Done," Wyatt said immediately. He had served the king for 11 years. He had never, in those 11 years, heard anyone give orders in this office with quite that particular quality of calm, specific authority. He found he did not mind it at all. Right away. "Oh, Luna." What followed was 36 hours. Sabrina worked in the archive with the focused, unhurried intensity of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for, and was entirely confident they were going to find it. Marmon brought her coffee. She forgot to drink. Dermin posted security at the archive door. Wyatt provided system access, and then stood back with the professional respect of a man who understood that he was not the expert in the room. She found what she knew she would find. Resno Turlo, the disgraced former council auditor Bess had hired, was skilled. But skill, in Sabrina's professional estimation, was not the same as thoroughness. Turlo had built a convincing surface. He had not, however, been inside the Iron Vale Archive's specific security architecture, and he had not known about the cross-referencing system Sabrina had built 3 years ago, a layered digital authentication protocol that was, in plain language, a document's way of remembering every single person who had touched it, and exactly when. The metadata inconsistency was in File 7 of the complaint's supporting documentation, a timestamp that placed Sabrina's terminal activity at 1:17 in the morning, but which did not account for the fact that Sabrina had logged out of all PAC systems at 10:42 on the night of the ceremony, at the exact moment Bess Doolin formally severed the mate bond, and her PAC access was simultaneously suspended. The document had been created on her terminal. It had not been created by her. But that was not the most significant thing she found. Hidden in the Iron Vale PAC's financial records, the records she had built, organized, and maintained for 4 years, was a pattern she had noticed once before and filed in the back of her mind, under investigate when circumstances allow. Small, consistent redirections of funds from the PAC's communal welfare reserve, amounts modest enough to avoid triggering automated alerts, routing paths that changed regularly, but always, ultimately, arrived at the same private account. An account registered to Ralph Doolin. Sabrina sat back in her chair for a moment, looking at the screen. She thought about the border skirmish report, the misfiled date, the healers sent in before the perimeter was secured. She thought about her parents. She opened a new document and began to write. The Eastern Council chamber at Thornwall Keep was built for weight. The dark timber panelling, a vaulted ceiling, a semicircular arrangement of seats around a central table of pale mountain stone, the kind of room designed to make proceedings feel permanent. 3 senior alphas from different territories had come in person. The others attended via secure transmission. Marmon sat at the head of the table. The chair beside him, a chair that had never been occupied at a formal session in the Keep's history, had been placed there by Winnie Conway that morning, without being asked, with the quiet certainty of someone who understood that something had changed and was already reorganizing the world around the change. Sabrina sat in it. She wore a deep burgundy dress. Her hair was down. Her posture was what it always was, not performed, simply inhabited. But on the table in front of her was a single slim document case. Bess Doolin arrived with Resno Turlough and 2 council-appointed advocates, projecting the slightly stiff confidence of a man who has convinced himself his preparation is adequate. He looked at Sabrina once, quickly, when he entered, and something in her expression, some quality of complete and settled calm, made his prepared confidence waver slightly at its edges. His advocates laid out the case efficiently. The digital evidence was presented. The timeline was constructed. The narrative was coherent and, on its surface, convincing. Sabrina let them finish. Then she stood up. She set her document case on the table, opened it, and began. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform outrage or injustice. She simply presented. Document by document. With the methodical precision of someone who had spent years making complicated things clear, she dismantled the complaint from the inside out. The metadata inconsistency, the access logs, the authentication protocol that Turlough hadn't known existed. The file activity records that showed her terminal had been accessed by someone using an override code, and the security system log that identified, with complete specificity, whose override code it was. The screen behind her displayed Alpha Thomas Blackwood's authorization code, used at 1:12 in the morning, on Sabrina's terminal, 3 hours after she had left the pack. Then she opened the second section of her presentation, the welfare reserve redirections, the routing paths, the private account. 6 years of records laid out with the careful, the irrefutable clarity of an archivist who had been building this documentation for months without fully understanding, until tonight, what she was going to use it for. Ralph Doolin's name appeared on the projection in clean, simple text. The room was very quiet. Bess's senior advocate closed his folder. Not dramatically, just quietly, with the particular finality of a man who is no longer willing to be in the room for what is about to happen professionally. "We no longer represent Mr. Doolin," he said, effective immediately. Ralph Doolin made a sound that was not a word. Bess sat frozen, his face the careful blank of someone whose internal processing has temporarily exceeded its capacity. Then something broke in him. The pride, the careful composure, the practiced certainty that had carried him through the last 2 weeks of desperate planning. He came to his feet. His eyes went dark. His voice, when it came, was not the voice of the beta heir of a powerful pack. It was the voice of a man who has lost everything and is converting that loss, with terrible speed, into something sharp. He moved across the table. Wyatt Hobbs was already there. He stepped in front of Sabrina with the silent economy of someone for whom threat response was not a decision, but a reflex. He caught Bess by the collar, not violently, not dramatically, simply with the complete and total certainty of someone who is significantly better at this than the person they are stopping. He returned Bess to his seat with an efficiency that made it look gentle, even when it wasn't. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Marmon stood. He had not spoken for the duration of Sabrina's presentation. He had sat at the head of the table with his hands resting on the pale stone surface, and his gold eyes moving between the evidence on the screen and the face of his mate delivering it, and his expression throughout had been the expression of a man watching something he already believed in being proven correct in front of witnesses. Now he looked at Bess Doolin with the complete, final, absolute lack of interest of a man who has made a decision and will not be revisiting it. "The complaint against Sabrina Mills is dismissed with prejudice," he said. "The financial evidence has been forwarded to the full council and to the appropriate oversight authorities. Ralph Doolin's accounts remain frozen. Resno Turlo is permanently banned from council proceedings." He looked at Bess one last time. "You had everything the moon offered you," he said. "You chose this instead. There is nothing more to say." He turned away. He walked to Sabrina, who was closing her document case with the calm, neat movements of someone completing a task that has been done correctly. Marmon reached out and very gently closed his hand over hers, stilling her movements. She looked up. "It's over," he said quietly. "I know," she said. He looked at her, really looked, with those gold eyes that had been doing this since the first night in the hall. This thing of looking at her as though she were both surprising and inevitable. "You were extraordinary in there," he said. "I was thorough," she corrected. "Those are different things." The corner of his mouth moved. "But they are," he agreed. "You are both." She felt the warmth of the bond move through her, steady and deep and entirely certain, and for a long, quiet moment in the empty council chamber, with the mountain visible through the tall windows and the morning light coming in clean and cold, Sabrina Mills allowed herself to simply feel it. All of it. The warmth and the certainty, and the steady, particular happiness of someone who has found, against all expectation, exactly the right place to be. 1 month after the council hearing, Winter arrived at Thornwall Keep with the decisive confidence of something that owned the place. Snow came down through the pines in the pre-dawn hours and continued through the morning, piling in deep, clean drifts against the stone walls and lying smooth and undisturbed across the courtyard until Winnie Conway's youngest staff members, apparently operating on the philosophy that untouched snow was an opportunity, began what could only be described as an organized conflict near the East Wing entrance. Sabrina watched this from the archive window with a warm mug in her hand and a private smile on her face, and then returned to the territorial restructuring proposal she had been working on for the past 3 weeks. The full Eastern Council had been summoned to Thornwall Keep. They began arriving the evening before, alphas and their senior advisors from 7 territories, some of whom had held their positions for decades, and had, in those decades, developed firm views about how pack governance worked and who was qualified to shape it. And several of them had sent diplomatic inquiries in advance, phrased with the careful indirectness of people who were not quite asking whether the Lunar Queen was going to be present at the formal session, but were very much wanting to know the answer. Marmon had replied to each inquiry personally. His replies were brief and identical. She will be presiding. The council chamber on the morning of the formal session was full in a way it rarely was. Not just the alphas, but their senior advisors, the Keep's own council representatives, and 4 attending scribes who were there specifically to record the proceedings for the permanent archive. The long mountain stone table was covered in documents, territorial maps, and the careful organizational work of Sabrina's 3-week preparation. Marmon took his seat at the head of the table. Or the chair beside him, Winnie Conway had polished it herself that morning, waited. Sabrina walked in. She wore a gown of deep forest green, simple and well-made, with silver at her throat, a piece Marmon had given her quietly, without ceremony, on the 2nd week of her time at the Keep, pressing it into her hands in the archive with the slightly uncertain expression of a man who was not practiced in giving gifts, but had thought about this particular one for several days. She wore her hair down. She carried her document case and set it on the table beside her seat with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything, and then she sat down and looked at the assembled council with clear, direct eyes that were not performing authority or asking for it, simply inhabiting it the way she inhabited every room she worked in, or from the inside out. Alpha Isaac Conway of the Northern Ridge, one of the oldest and most respected members of the council, a man who had, the day before, sent one of the politely indirect inquiries about her role, looked at her across the table for a long, assessing moment. Then he nodded. Once, slowly. The particular nod of someone updating a previously held position with new information. Marmon addressed the council briefly. The formal acknowledgement of proceedings, the record of the Iron Veil situation, the charges confirmed against Ralph Doolin, and the fraudulent complaint against Sabrina. Then he turned to her. "My queen will present her findings and her recommendation," he said. She stood. The chamber settled into the particular quality of attention that Sabrina had learned in her weeks at the keep, what was Marmon's natural environment. Not silence exactly, but the focused, wait-forward quiet of people who were genuinely prepared to listen. She began. She had organized the presentation the way she organized everything, by starting with the most important fact and building outward from there. The most important fact was this: the Iron Veil Pact's territorial lands were now part of the Eastern Reaches, and 340 wolves needed a home, a leadership structure, and a clear legal framework for what their future looked like. She addressed each element in turn. The innocent pack members, the workers, the healers, the families, the lower-ranked wolves who had built their lives inside Iron Veil's borders because it was the only structure they had been given, were to be offered full integration into the Eastern Reaches, what their land rights honored, their existing community structures preserved where functional, their records, she had already begun the work of cross-indexing them with the Keep's archive, maintained with the same care as every other document in the system. The corrupt elements of the Iron Veil leadership, Ralph Doolin's financial network, Resno Turlo, the pack enforcers who had used their position to keep lower-ranked members silent about the welfare fund misappropriations, were to face full council sanctions and permanent exile from the Eastern Reaches. When she reached the section about Bess Doolin, the chamber went quiet in a particular way, the waiting quiet of people anticipating either severity or mercy, and not quite certain which direction the wind was going to blow. Sabrina took a breath. "I recommend," she said, "no exile, no formal sanction beyond what the Council's standard protocol requires." Someone at the far end of the table made a small sound of surprise. "Instead," she continued, "I recommend a formal record, his actions on the night of the Harvest Moon ceremony, and his subsequent choices, to be documented accurately and permanently in the Council archive. The full account, without editorial and without omission." She paused. "I was told that I worked in the dark," she said, her voice even and clear. "I would like the Council to understand that the dark is precisely where the truth lives. Someone has to be willing to carry a light. That is what archivists do. That is what I have always done." She sat down. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then Alpha Isaac Conway began to applaud. Slowly, with the deliberate quality of someone making a decision in real time. His advisor joined him. Then the Alpha from the Southern Territory. Then, one by one, around the entire length of the mountain stone table, the assembled council of the Eastern Reaches acknowledged the Lunar Queen of Thornwall Keep. Marmon did not applaud. He was looking at her, only at her, with the expression she had come to know as the most genuine one he had. Not the contained authority he wore in council. Not the careful warmth he was still, at times, slightly uncertain how to express. This was the expression of a man looking at someone who has just done something that confirmed everything he believed about them, and who is, quietly and completely, in awe. He reached across the table and took her hand. She looked at him. He said nothing. He didn't need to. No, that evening, the council members had retired to their quarters, and the keep had settled into the warm, fire-lit quiet of a winter night. Sabrina stood on the stone balcony outside their suite. Their suite, a word she was still practicing, that still felt new and solid and right in her mouth, wrapped in a heavy fur-lined cloak, looking out over the river valley below. The snow had stopped. The clouds had cleared. The sky was enormous and full of stars, and the mountains on the far side of the valley were pale and immense in the darkness, and the river far below caught the moonlight and held it. The balcony door opened. Marmon stepped out beside her, a second warm mug in his hand, which he passed to her without ceremony. He stood close, not performing closeness, simply present, the way he always was, with the particular quality of someone who had spent a long time alone and had learned, in the last month, that being beside someone was something his body had been waiting to understand. "The council wants a formal bonding ceremony," he said after a while. "Before the winter solstice." Sabrina was quiet for a moment, looking at the river below. "That's only 6 weeks away." "I know." She turned to look at him. His profile in the darkness was still and strong, and she noticed, as she always noticed now, the thing Winnie Conway had told her in the first week, that he was different, that the people who worked in this compound and had known him for years watched him now with a particular quality of gentle, surprised gladness, the way you watch someone you love remember how to be happy. "You're not exactly patient," she said. He turned to look at her. And there it was, the thing she had seen first on the night of the harvest moon, across the great hall of the Iron Vale estate, in the moment he stopped moving and the world had arranged itself differently. The openness, the wondering, certain, entirely unguarded expression of a man who has found something he was not expecting and intends to keep it with everything he has. "I waited my entire life for you," Marmon said. Not a declaration, not a performance, just the plain, honest truth of it, said the way he said everything that mattered, quietly and with complete conviction. 6 weeks, he said, is already generous. Sabrina looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the mountains. She looked at the river, holding the moonlight. She thought about the archive in the east wing, where the first section was already cross-indexed, and the rest was waiting, organized and ready, for the long, careful, worthwhile work of setting things in the right order. She reached up and rested her palm against his jaw, the way she had done once before, in the candlelight of the great hall, in the moment before everything changed. He closed his eyes, the way he had then, and leaned into her hand with the quiet, complete trust of someone who has spent a long time not knowing how to do this, and has simply decided, with the certainty he brought to every decision, that this is the person worth learning for. "Okay," she said softly. 6 weeks. He opened his eyes. He covered her hand with his. The bond between them was warm and steady, and entirely at home in both their chests. It was the way things are warm and steady when they have finally arrived where they were always going. He pressed a kiss to her palm. She smiled. The mountains were immense and cold and permanent around them, and the stars were extraordinary, and the river caught the moonlight far below, and on the stone balcony of Thornwall Keep, Sabrina Mills, the girl nobody counted, the archivist who worked in the dark, the woman who had been told she had nothing to offer, stood in the arms of the man the universe had been building toward her all along, and felt, for the first time in her life, that the world was not only exactly the right size, it was exactly the right shape. 6 months later, spring had come to the mountains. The snow had retreated to the highest peaks. The river valley was green and loud with meltwater, and the pine forest around Thornwall Keep had acquired the particular lush, vivid quality of things that have been cold for a long time and are finally, gratefully, warm. The Iron Vale lands had been formally integrated. The displaced pack members had arrived in stages through the winter, cautiously at first, then with increasing ease as the eastern reaches proved to be, in practice, exactly what Sabrina had promised in her council presentation. A place where people were valued for their work rather than their rank, and where the records of that work were kept with care. Jayne Finch had arrived in February with 2 oversized bags, a detailed list of improvements she had identified for the Keep's communications infrastructure, and the cheerful, purposeful energy of someone who has been waiting for the right context to deploy their full capabilities. She was currently managing the estate's internal and external communications with an efficiency that had caused Winnie Conway to look at her, after the first 3 weeks, with an expression of deeply satisfied approval. They had become, somewhat inevitably, friends. The archive had been expanded. A full new wing, temperature-controlled, with dedicated sections for the integrated Iron Vale documentation and the ongoing territorial records of the Eastern Reach's growing jurisdiction. Beside the archive entrance, a small brass plaque had been mounted on the stone wall. Sabrina's doing, in a quiet moment, with a small toolkit and the particular satisfaction of someone marking something correctly. It read, Sabrina Richmond, Chief Territorial Archivist and Lunar Queen of the Eastern Reaches. On a Tuesday morning in late April, Sabrina was at the cedar work table in the center of the archive, a warm mug at her elbow, and a historical boundary map spread in front of her, when she heard the quiet sound of the archive door. She didn't look up. The council delegates arrive at 11. I know, Marmon said, from the doorway. I scheduled them. I know that too. She looked up then. He was leaning in the doorframe with the easy, unhurried quality he had developed over the months. The quality of a man who has stopped carrying the particular tension of someone who has always been alone, and has replaced it with the particular ease of someone who knows exactly where home is. He was watching her with the expression she knew best now, the one she had first seen on the night of the harvest moon across the great hall of the Iron Vale estate, before either of them had spoken a single word, the expression of a man looking at something he was not expecting to find, and has not, for a single day since, stopped being grateful for. Ready? He asked. She capped her pen. She closed the map. She picked up her document case. She crossed the archive and stopped in front of him, looking up with the clear, direct gaze that had— she knew this because Dermin had told her, with the quiet sincerity of someone who rarely spoke about things that mattered to him, been the first thing Marmon had described to anyone in the days after the harvest moon. I was always ready, Sabrina said. Nobody just thought to ask. He smiled. What a real one. The full, unguarded smile that the people of Thornwall Keep had spent years hoping to see on his face, and that had been arriving, since October, with increasing regularity. He took her hand. She took his. They walked out of the archive and into the bright mountain morning together, into the spring light, into the sound of the river below, into the life that the moon had been quietly, patiently, and with considerable satisfaction building for them from the very beginning. Behind them, the brass plaque caught the morning light and held it. Sabrina Richmond. The girl nobody counted, carrying the light.